Christian, in what ways do you think Asian families differ in their needs and issues compared with families from elsewhere in the world?
I find that when you're dealing with Asian families, they like to hear about Asian families. So for me, I'm always looking for, what's the research papers, what do we know specifically about Asian families, to try and get it away from the European or American thinking. And one of the places that I like to start is with this research that was done here in Hong Kong, maybe about 15 or 16 years ago, on what is the life cycle of the Chinese family firms. A lot of the wealthy families across Asia are overseas Chinese families. And we know more about what happens to Chinese family firms over 3 generations than most people realise.
So what happens to each generation in this example?
There's a framework which looks at ownership succession in the Chinese family firm. It basically says that in the first generation you have a founder who comes along who creates a business, and he's your typical Asian patriarch. He has total control. He has total control over the family, total control over the ownership, total control over the business. He likes to keep his cards very close to his chest. He's typically very secretive, and he doesn't model collaborative decision making. But the culture is that in the second generation, the share ownership will be passed on to the typically the male heirs in the family in equal shares. And so the second generation ownership is called a segmented stage of ownership, where these siblings have to learn how to work together, and bearing in mind, remembering that the father, the patriarch, is usually not taught the siblings to work together very well. And so when the siblings start to get married, when the siblings start to have their own children who get old and come and enter into the business, it's very typical that you will have conflicts will start at that time. And this ownership model is very interesting. It says that when you get to the third generation, it starts to, the ownership control starts to disintegrate, basically. And you get shares that start to pass on to cousins. The shareholding of each individual cousin starts to become very small. And what happens is that you get a breakdown in decision making by the owners in the family business. And you get many, many small outside shareholders who don't support the management of the business anymore. So one of the classic conflicts in a family business is a conflict between the outside shareholders and the inside shareholders. And inside shareholders referring to the people who have management roles in the business. And so all of this concludes that just the way that you divide up ownership in the family business will tell you how long the family business will last for.
Christian, so what should Asian patriarchs be focusing on when it comes to succession planning?
They think that when they're planning for succession, the important task is to think about who is going to succeed them to lead the business. So what's the management succession going to be? But when you look at this research, it actually shows you that the ownership succession question has more of an impact on how long your family firm is going to last for than the management succession question. So ownership is more important than management over the long run.
Christian, so this is talking about research that happened 15 or 16 years ago. How have the issues relating to Asian families changed?
In Asia today, we are starting to see a generational transition. You know, the most obvious sign of that is unfortunately the family feuds that make it into the newspaper. But our patriarch generation is well over 80, and we are seeing this transition in Asia today. So I think Asian families, especially the more traditional ones, are still behaving the same way that they were 16 years ago, 20 years ago or longer. But there is an increased awareness in Asia today about the importance of family governance. There's increased interest, and this is also being promoted by the wealth management industry here, of looking at the topics of family businesses. How do you avoid conflicts in family businesses? What are the best practices around succession and governance in family businesses? So there's a rising level of awareness and appreciation of better practices. But I think we're at that tipping point, possibly, where we haven't yet seen a critical mass of Asian families starting to actually implement some of these best practices. So a lot of awareness level is going up but actual action is not there yet.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
But this 16-year-old research is still fully valid today, and it's very powerful because it's Asian research. It gives an Asian family a reason why they should take some action. So personally, I find that if you go to an Asian family and say, look, here's some research which has been done in the US, it says, for example, ownership is more important than management, you need to have a family council and a family constitution and family policies. It's just not as powerful as giving the message, you know, here's some Asian specific research, this is what happens to Asian families.